Welcome back to the Lou Perez Podcast. My name is Lou Perez. If you'd like to support the podcast, please head over to thelouperez.locals.com and join the Lou Perez community. If you join, you'll get to listen to the podcast early. You'll get to watch my sketch comedy early, as well as experience other exclusive content. So I hope you enjoy it. And if you're looking for another way to support me, you can do so by supporting my sponsors. So if you're into cold brew, I highly recommend Black Organic Cold Brew. Head over to www.blvckbrew.com and use promo code LOU, that's LOU, and you'll get free shipping. And if you're into CBD products, please check out Paloma Verde, www.palomaverdestore.com. And if you use the code LOU, you'll get 25% off purchases over $75. And if you sign up for email, you'll get an extra 10% off as well. All right, here we go. Sadly, I think we've gotten to the point where, if it does come out that, alien life made contact with us, I think it'll be, pretty big for a couple of days, and then it'll just go away. We'll be on to something else. I am so happy for my next guest to be joining me. His name is Todd Seavey. He is a writer. He's the author of the book Libertarians for Beginners, which is celebrating its 5th anniversary. He's a man about town, and also I'm happy to say he's a buddy. He's a friend of mine. And
thanks.
Yeah, and Todd, I forget how long ago we met, but I think it was one of those things where we were we found each other at a lot of Reason Magazine and Reason TV events.
Right. Actually, it's funny. Like a lot of people, I find myself almost forgetting how life worked before COVID. Mm-hmm. But certainly for free market leaning people in New York City, a lot of how we met stories are vague, fuzzily remembered ones that involve cocktail parties or luncheons or think tank events or something, which is not very exciting. But yeah, I think we two probably met at a Reason event or something. Oh, well, obviously it changed our lives.
Yeah, changed our lives forever. Mm-hmm. So you're going to be celebrating the 5th anniversary of libertarianism for beginners. Mm-hmm. So how did that book come about?
Let's see. Actually, there's a book publishing company that specializes in doing books that all have the title formula blank for beginners. So they'll recruit people to do architecture for beginners or Nietzsche for beginners and so forth. And they wanted to do libertarianism for beginners, probably in part because back in 2016, when it came out, hard as this is to believe now, it looked for a short time as if Rand Paul might be like the front runner for the Republican nomination. We were so naive back then. And then by the time the book came out, libertarianism had been completely and utterly destroyed and forgotten, and Trump and populism took over the Republican Party, and we live in a very different world now.
Yeah, I remember during one of the debates when there were like 17 Republicans on the stage, and it was probably like an hour and a half into the debate, and Trump was destroying everybody on the stage, not with anything really substantive, but just mocking. He was basically like doing a roast battle up there. And I was watching the debate. I think it was I was at a bar, and a few drinks in, and then Rand Paul starts talking about the drug war and starts talking about how marijuana should be at least decriminalized and all that. And I was texting back and forth with a friend of mine who is a Democrat, left-leaning, very, very supportive of that side of the aisle. And I was saying, and we were basically talking about, I'm like, nobody is hearing this. Like, nobody is hearing this important message because we are an hour and a half deep into a 70, basically like a Royal Rumble of Republicans.
I think there was a debate in January of 2016, if I remember correctly, a Republican primary debate where Trump pretty much destroyed Rand Paul by literally making fun of his hair and his height. And that was, when I realized that maybe the philosophical arguments I'd spent the 2.5 prior decades honing really didn't matter.
Right.
Oh, well. But the book is still out there if you want to buy a copy. Amazon, Barnes and Noble. Libertarianism continues to exist. Remember, it's a philosophy. So even if everyone stops believing in it in an abstract sense, it still exists.
Yeah. Well, there's the cliche of, you're not a real libertarian, or so-and-so said this, and a real libertarian wouldn't say that. And well, when you're working, with those kinds of people, and I'm a part of those kinds of people, even though I don't necessarily ever say like, oh, you're not a real libertarian. What's it like to write a book where you're obviously there's a good chance you're going to piss off a bunch of libertarian nerds who really know their stuff.
It helped to write it again, like just before the Trump era really began, in part because my naivete about how vicious and combative people can get was still in place. Maybe I should issue a blanket apology for everything I ever said before that, in that I didn't really think people took political combat that seriously. So if they insulted each other or said, everybody who thinks that should be hung, I just assumed nobody actually meant it. Mm-hmm. And now for the last 5 years, they've actually been having street fights and, Proud Boys punching Antifa and stuff like that, as one of your recent guests, Andy Neo, knows so well. So at the time I was writing it in more of a philosophy student frame of mind, not like Street Fighter, but more like, oh, hey, here are these different schools of thought and they're all kind of fun. And I'll put them together and taxonomize them a little and make a little glossary in the back. And what harm could it do? And we can learn from all of these things. And as Chairman Mao said, let 100 flowers bloom. And now I think probably a lot of people are either terrified that everything they say or every philosophical deviation will result in a Twitter swarm of angry maniacs, or like a lot of you comedians, they just sort of develop thicker skin and sort of decide like, I don't care. I'm just going to forge ahead. And if everybody thinks I'm a jerk, I'll just live with it. And that'll be part of the MO, which in some ways is good. And in some ways a sad thing, because I was more of a philosophy student at heart than a combatant. Although I'm sure there are plenty of people who think I'm a jerk. So if I had to do the book now, I think I would be much more conscious of the fact that there are tripwires everywhere and all these factions who hate each other and stuff. Back when I wrote it, and for the preceding couple of decades, it kind of seemed like there were at most like two big libertarian factions, loosely referred to sometimes as the Mises camp and the Cato/Reason camp. Mm-hmm. And and some people liked elements of both of them as I did, and didn't worry too much about them trying to really destroy each other. If they didn't like each other, they just didn't talk to each other. But it didn't seem like that tribalistic or combative a field. And now there are so many little camps and petty hatreds that I can't keep track of them. You could write a whole book just sort of taxonomizing all the different groups, whereas I tried to relegate that to the glossary and a couple of lists in the books, but treat it like there was at least a consensus philosophy that virtually all libertarians could agree on, and my main goal was convert the world, I guess, inform the world. I mean, I wasn't really proselytizing per se with the book, but inform the outside world what libertarians in general are thinking, whereas now you almost have to assume that first you fight 16 other factions of libertarians, and then if you can get them to agree on something, you go out and try to convert the rest of the world, and fail, of course.
Yeah. I found, I've talked about this before, that my wife had never heard of libertarianism or ever met a libertarian that she knows of before she met me. So I'm her first. I'm her her chaperone into this world. And it's interesting to, anytime I hear people talk about libertarians, for the most part, my first reaction is often, oh, I don't think you've ever met a libertarian before. It seems like a lot of people have this idea of what a libertarian is or what libertarians believe out there. And so often they always mix it with, Ayn Rand or objectivism. And as far as I know, Ayn Rand didn't like the idea of being called a libertarian, and she had her, big problems with that. So I think that there's that hurdle. And then the other thing I always hear is sort of like, oh yeah, libertarians, that's something to talk. That's the kind of stuff you talk about in your dorm room, but here in the real world, And it's like, wow, it's interesting. So in my dorm room, that's where I need to talk about, ownership of your own body, doing away with the war on drugs, legalizing sex work and doing away with foreign wars. It's like when I mature and, step out of the dorm, then I get to put that stuff aside. So is there a question there? Well, I guess, it's sort of how, obviously you are, making an attempt to educate people on this stuff. Do you think it's worked? Not even necessarily it's been all on you, but do you think, 5 years, 5 years after the release, has the world woken up a little bit more to libertarianism?
I mean, I think it's been so distracted by fighting over populist stuff and Trump that a lot of people probably barely even remember the econ arguments that used to matter. I suppose one of my new pet peeves is that a lot of libertarians, self-proclaimed libertarians, kind of behave as if they barely remember the economics arguments and constitutionalism arguments that started the movement. Just to take a couple examples I've found myself talking about recently. I would have thought that property rights adherence is not only central to the philosophy, but a pretty good litmus test of whether you are behaving like a real libertarian, so to speak, or not. But there are some people out there who call themselves libertarians who, if they're right-leaning, think that that should mean you can go into a store with your mask off and your gun on your hip, even if the owner doesn't want you there. Mm-hmm. Which doesn't sound like deference to property owners to me. And then, of course, on the left-leaning side, there are some fringier, perhaps rarer libertarians who've tried to incorporate very specific cultural requirements, like you have to love the trans movement or something. There are a few libertarians who sound sort of like 19th century style left anarchists and think that you should be opposed to bosses and landlords and stuff like that, which all sounds kind of Marxist to me, but there is a tradition of that sort of thinking. And then in the middle, actually, maybe the center left or the liberal-leaning libertarians, you get a lot who I think pride themselves on how casual and relaxed they are about the whole philosophy, but that means they're allowed to dabble and sort of pick and choose. They're like, oh, I kind of like carbon taxes, but not so much anti-pot laws, but maybe anti-cocaine laws are okay. And like, it's all just kind of a hobby and they can pick and choose whatever they want. Some of those people are pleasant to be around and they're the ones serving the hors d'oeuvres, so you have to be nice to them. But that's no way to run a philosophy if you're actually trying to get people to learn and adhere to some sort of clear principles. And then the right-leaning version of those people in the center, I guess, would be kind of maybe the average Fox News commentator who's good about the free market in some ways, but kind of gives a pass to the police and or military, or is unsympathetic to concerns about how much the state targets fringe groups, marginalized people, and that sort of thing. They might not want to hear about the history of imperialism being a terrible, bloody thing, because that sounds like lefty talk,
Yeah. I think, before we started recording this, I was talking about my interest in anarchy, especially having friends like yourself who've talked about it, and I think sort of what you've just demonstrated here, given examples of, is that it's really tough to be a principled libertarian, or basically to be a principled person to begin with, where it's sort of, yeah, even if you're a principled, even if say you're a Marxist, I bet it's really tough for people to be Marxists nowadays, because it's, the reality is in your day-to-day life, you have to give here, or you're kind of forced to give in to certain things. And my attraction to libertarianism, it took me a while to realize this, but it ultimately came down to the principle of non-aggression. And for a while, especially over the past year or so, I've been thinking like, well, wait a minute, if I'm against the non-aggression principle, if I think you can't initiate force, then how the hell can I defend a state? How the hell can I, how the hell can I do that? And so it's around 9 p.m. on a Thursday, and I haven't slept very much because my son is waking me up in the middle of the night.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. But so I'm having all of these things of all of these thoughts of, I'm a father and I want to raise my son well, and I want to raise him to be a good person, and I want to be a good person. And here I believe this philosophy, and yet I call myself a minarchist some days, like, so where's the hope for me? Do I have, am I thinking too much?
I guess Matt Kibbe pointed out a way that you can render libertarianism so simple and agreeable sounding that it actually is quite suitable for teaching to children, which might help you with the fathering. He rightly pointed out that if libertarians are mainly opposed to assault, theft, and fraud, that's sort of like trying to teach the world the basic playground lesson that you shouldn't lie, you shouldn't steal, and you shouldn't punch people. So if you start off there, that's relatively simple and might help anchor your sea and your boat in the tumultuous sea of philosophy. For a long time, I think the reason I probably didn't sound like an anarchist, even though technically I was, my whole adult life, technically I've been an anarcho-capitalist, that is, someone who wants people to adhere to property rights and therefore completely get rid of government. But I probably didn't sound that radical all the time because I thought, okay, there are so few anarcho-capitalists, and back then, I figure like in the 90s, I wasn't even sure there was more than another 20 or 30 such people out there. I assumed I should just start out with kind of the easy parts of the message and gradually, maybe over decades, ratchet it up a little and get more radical sounding. So I thought, start out by criticizing, say, the stupidest government programs, things that almost everybody would agree are boondoggles, total waste of money, aren't even achieving their own stated aims. And because of that, thought of myself as kind of compatible with the Republicans, because at least they were often criticizing wasteful programs or calling for spending or tax cuts. And then gradually, I started to get sort of more radical. The original plan was, as society becomes more libertarian, I will keep getting more radical to push the envelope. And instead, what ended up happening is society pretty much stayed the same, and I just got more and more impatient and thus more radical sounding. But also, I did realize over time that people, regardless of their philosophies, they tend to respect consistency. So if you're picking your battles, even if you're trying to do it to be maximally persuasive, people often feel like, oh, you've chosen a team and that's all that matters. Whereas if you seem like you're swinging for the bleachers from the get-go, and you're willing to say right off the bat, I think the entire government should be abolished. No one should ever use anybody else's body or property without permission. I'm against the drug war, normal wars, imperialism, the welfare state, border walls, and everything else. They at least realize, like, oh, okay, he's putting his cards on the table and being consistent. So now, whether it's principle or exhaustion and impatience, I tend to just lead with the whole radical story from the get-go. There is a tendency, that, especially on like Twitter lately, I think, for people to pretend that they're sort of radical because they're very combative, but they're actually kind of scared to explain exactly where they stand, and probably couldn't articulate exactly what their principles are. So they make up for it in some cases, I think, especially young males, I would venture to guess, by sounding really combative about the things they know a bunch of other people agree with them on. So, they might spend all day ranting about how much they hate the left, but if you really started picking at exactly what their principles were, or God forbid, ask them a tricky philosophical problem, like, you're stuck on a rowboat in the middle of the ocean and one person is starving, the other one has food and so forth, they'd freak out if they didn't have recourse to insulting you with a couple of tweets. So I think the speed of Twitter is making philosophy harder to do in some ways. There's more, I guess, more noise than authentic radicalism in the philosophical sense, I suspect.
Yeah. Well, I wonder too. It's sort of as I've gotten older and I've gotten very tired, as I've explained, where it's sort of, what role can I possibly be playing to bring about the world that I want to see? Because it's like, well, how much power do I really have? And at what point am I sort of, leading with, like, sort of how you said, I believe in this, I believe this, I believe this, I believe this, but it's like, I'm not necessarily putting my body on the line. I'm not necessarily putting my freedom, on the line. And it's like, how much of it is me, how much is it me sort of trying to make myself believe that I really believe this stuff? I had, when I was in college, I went to NYU, and the best class that I had at NYU was a class with this guy, Mark Cohen, and it was called Belief and Skepticism. And it was a really great class because we had these really difficult conversations. And I wasn't a philosophy, major or anything like that, but we had these really, really interesting discussions. And one day in class, I said, I don't care about Africa. And there were, gasps, like, and, other students were like, what? How don't you care? What? You don't care about Africa? And I said, yeah, I don't care about Africa. Look where I am. I'm here in New York. Now, I could say that I care about Africa, but I'm still here in New York. I'm not doing anything in Africa. I'm not over there trying to help people. Maybe, if I send $5, like, does that really show that I care? I guess it made a nice little impact on Mark, the professor, because he's like, wow, he's like, that's something interesting to think about. Can you really say you care about something if you're not doing anything to actually show that that you care about it? I do, wonder sometimes with this sort of stuff where it's like, well, what am I doing, and what can I possibly be doing to show people that I actually care about this stuff? And I don't know if that's more of like a practical day-to-day anarchism, if you will, or anarcho-capitalism, or I don't know. I need help. You're my priest.
Oh, well, actually, it's funny. 4 major libertarian philosophers crossed my mind because of those comments. I think it was Adam Smith who said we should confess that it is natural for the average person to care much more about a cut on his own finger than hearing about 10,000 people killed by an earthquake in distant China or something along those lines. However, it also reminds me that one of the reasons I'm a utilitarian, and in a way more foundationally than a libertarian, is because utilitarianism teaches that the real moral goal ultimately is trying to maximize everyone's happiness. And if you're a rule utilitarian, you don't just run around willy-nilly from act to act trying to make people more happy, but you look for those rules that'll tend to foster maximum human happiness amongst the entire population over the long haul. And I think those rules are property rights rules. So in that sense, I'm a utilitarian libertarian, or a bit like early Rothbard, the libertarian economist. So even if your natural emotional inclination is to not care about some distant land, I do think it's good to be a universalist who recognizes that everyone's happiness matters. And you want to promulgate those rules that, whether it's in your own backyard or on the other side of the planet, will tend to make people more happy. And I get a little nervous sometimes when I hear some of the paleo conservative leaning libertarians will rightly observe that universalism is sort of dangerous and it could lead to people thinking like imperialists. But then they'll say, therefore we should be very local in our thinking and suspicious of immigrants and newcomers and that sort of thing. And it's nice if they're trying to avoid the excesses or impersonal qualities of universalism, but morality is still supposed to be universal. It's not like New Yorkers have an obligation not to steal until they go to New Jersey, and then it becomes okay. So I would say the way that you manage to make yourself behave as if you care about the people in New Jersey or on the other side of the planet is by adopting some set of universal rules, such as property rights, that will apply wherever you go. And that way, hopefully, you'll sympathize with cases of rights violations, even on the other side of the planet. Mm-hmm. Oh, and I was also reminded of Ayn Rand during your comments, because although I'm not an objectivist either, I do think she was right to point out that self-sacrifice is not necessarily the measure of whether you're accomplishing things in this world. So you shouldn't feel too guilty if you find yourself thinking like, oh my gosh, I didn't sacrifice much for the cause today. I'm not beating myself up, and I spent all day worrying about my kid instead of how to get the message out. Yeah, you're allowed to take time off. And your self-sacrifice is not necessarily the best way to make the world a better place.
Yeah, you're talking about paleocons made me think of this joke where I said a paleocon sounds like a conservative who thinks dinosaurs choose to be gay, and that reminded me of that. But also, I think too, while I might have these thoughts swirling around in my mind, there is also the reality of me understanding how much change I can actually affect in the world. And I did the few months back, I think it was at the end of 2020, I was on a panel discussion about social justice and comedy, and I didn't do very well on the panel. Afterward, I was like, oh my god, I sound like just a babbling idiot, and I had all these really good responses like a week later, after I was just thinking about this stuff and just beating myself up over it. But to the question of, how can comedy help social justice or push social justice or social change? And, the reality is, well, if I'm at a show, the only change that I can effectively hope to create is to take an audience that isn't laughing to laughing. It's the idea that there's going to be something I'm going to say to make them go out into the world and, I don't know, change something on a bigger scale, I think is pretty slim. And I don't have a messiah complex or anything like that. But also, I think that there's something to be said for if you are able to entertain people, even on stage, and change things for the better, make a positive impact by making them laugh. Like, that is something that's actually pretty cool. And I think in the field of in the industry of comedy, I think I've just seen so many people who spent decades and decades of their lives doing this amazing thing, making people really happy, making people laugh, and then they turn around and they say, well, I should be doing something way more important than this. So now let me use my platform to speak out on all these different social issues.
And then tragically, they become Janine Garofalo.
Yeah, who I loved as an actress. Mm-hmm. I think she's a phenomenal actress. But yeah, there was a time where I remember seeing her like with like a notebook on stage, and I don't know what it was sort of like she was doing her version of Lenny Bruce reading his court transcripts or something like that.
Actually, back when people actually walked around in New York City, I wouldn't be surprised to find that you and I went to the same club where I guess comedians, I don't know if they still do this, but there was a place, I think on the Lower East Side, where they would deliberately try out new untested material. And I think Janine Garofalo would show up with a notebook at that and read sort of half-formed jokes that she was still working on, which is kind of cool. But yeah, maybe we might have seen her at the same place doing that shtick or proto shtick. Mm-hmm. And now, actually, you've reminded me of Scarlett Johansson, because apparently she just recently said that she's a little tired of actors being told that they're obliged to pursue political projects and have positions on everything. And I'm sure she knows full well a lot of actors aren't that well informed, and even if they can speak as if they are, they're actually just picturing some political movie they once saw, and they really don't have their statistics in place and stuff, except the occasional crank like Mark Ruffalo, and then we're probably worse off than if he didn't talk. But ScarJo, bless her, said, my job of making people feel like a story comes alive and making them empathize with someone who is different from themselves, and sympathize with an adventure they're watching. That's my job. That's how I enhance their lives. And this other stuff really doesn't fall within my job description. Her being willing to say that is a little bit like you being willing perhaps to tell a panel of comedians that spreading social justice isn't their first priority. Just being funny would be a surprising and immense accomplishment for most comedians, frankly.
With ScarJo, I remember seeing that tweet, and I think I retweeted it and said, oftentimes if you're an actor, you could actually end up hurting your cause. You could actually end up turning a lot of people off to it. I mean, just look what happened with, oh my God, last year you had you had Wonder Woman singing Imagine with a bunch of other actors, which I would just love never to hear that song ever again. And then I don't know if it was the same group of actors who then took responsibility for systemic racism and the deaths of unarmed Black men. But like, holy shit, was that cringe? That was really, look, I'm not going to say that anybody started saying, you know what? I didn't like the idea of police killing unarmed Black men, but then I saw these actors, and you know what? Now I'm in favor of it. I'm not saying that. It's just it was definitely cringe-worthy on some level for sure.
And by the way, if your old NYU philosophy class is worried that you're a callous monster, you are arguably, even as a callous college student, you are arguably being more politic than Ayn Rand objectivist promoter Yaron Brook. I remember seeing him do a big official talk where somebody raised their hand and said, well, don't you have a moral obligation to be worried about things like starvation in Africa? And there are a whole bunch of appropriate ways to answer that question that might even involve saying local concerns come first or something like that, or utilitarian ways of answering it that say my knowledge of my own circumstances are much greater than my knowledge of these distant problems. Maybe they need to be solved locally or whatever. Or of course, just the classic libertarian answer that markets will solve that problem better than government, and even a lot of NGOs will. Yaron Brook laughed. He basically laughed and said, what do I care about some children in Africa I will never meet? Wow. Like, that was his actual answer. And he was supposed to be officially representing Ayn Rand and objectivism. And he's regarded as a smart, wise spokesman for this philosophy. And I'm sure there were some people in the audience who thought he was doing a great job, but the undecided must have been horrified. So you, by contrast, I'll bet, sounded more human in that philosophy class than Yaron Brook did, and he's getting paid.
Yeah. Well, I gotta say one thing. I was definitely younger. I was probably 21, 22 years old. I was jacked. I worked out like every single day in college. I was ripped. I had my hair, I think, might have been around the same length, but it was jet black. I didn't have a beard at the time. I had a nice smooth skin. Man, I miss that kid. Yeah. Sometimes. Yeah.
So if you were really big, they probably thought you were like the thuggish heavy metal fan.
Yeah,
or at least in my day.
Well, at the time too, because I'm from Queens originally, and then I went to high school in Long Island, and during college, I had a thick Long Island accent, Queens Long Island hybrid accent. Which, just imagine hearing that, yo, whatever, man. I don't care about Africa. Like, how the fuck did that sound? Now that might have, that just, yo, bro, I don't care about Africa, bro. What the fuck? But sorry, go ahead.
I was saying, I actually had a brief but very philosophically significant connection to NYU. In between my own youth, when, amongst other things, I went to Brown, and then my adulthood spent in Manhattan working in various media projects. In between, back in the 90s, I attended about once a month a gathering at NYU of libertarians when they were rare and hard to find, called the CLO, or Classical Liberal Organization. I don't know if it still exists in some form after all this time, but run by Chris Whitten, who created one of the first libertarian websites in the whole world. And one of the people in our little discussion group, oddly enough, was the son of Hal Holbrook, the actor who recently passed away. And one of the most memorable things about Holbrook's son was that he was at that time an objectivist, or close to it. I wasn't, but he was, and so he was maybe a little more dismissive of like the problems of the homeless and the poor than some of the other people in the group. But he was like a really nice guy. So even when he complained about, say, behavior patterns amongst the homeless, you could clearly tell he was empathizing with them and asking, what would I do in their place? So for instance, one thing that stuck out in my mind is he said, you know, I hitchhiked across the country for a while, so I had some idea what it would be like to be homeless, because I didn't take any money with me and nobody knew who I was, and I would just hitchhike my way along. And I just kept thinking, why do I hear other bums asking for a hot meal? Help me get a hot meal. Hot meals are expensive. I would always try to buy a bologna roll. You can get a bologna roll really cheap and then eat that for like a week. That's the thing to do. He was perhaps more rational than the average homeless guy, but an amusing character. And
but I think
and sad that his dad passed away.
Well, I think the part that he's missing is sort of the marketing of asking for a hot meal versus just any cold meal. Because when you say hot meal, if I'm working in marketing, we're doing branding here, I immediately think home, mother, being taken care of, and it's sort of that exchange there can take place, as opposed to the hot bologna or the cold bologna sandwich, which sounds almost sexual in a way. So you went to Brown University. This is my opportunity to say I was accepted to Brown University, but I decided not to go to Brown University. And the reason why my older brother actually talked me into going to NYU, and the reason why is because I was offered an academic scholarship to go to NYU, and Brown wasn't giving me anything. And he said, look, try your first year at NYU, and if you don't like it, maybe you could transfer. But I ended up doing all 4 years at NYU.
And some people would argue that Manhattan is more exciting than Providence. So. Maybe that was the right call.
Well, I remember I visited the campus, Brown University, and I had a girlfriend at the time in high school. And this is the only time I ever cheated on a girlfriend. There was a very cute girl who was a part of the same, I think, pre-freshman tour or something like that. And she and I ended up kissing on the train ride back, and I never told my high school girlfriend until she and I reconnected when I was 30 years old. So there was a gap of probably like 8 years or so that like after college and stuff, I didn't speak to her. Then we reconnected, and I remember she told me that she was having a conversation with a guy who said like all men cheat, and she said, no, that's not true. In high school, I had a boyfriend and he never cheated. And then I had to break her, her heart at 29, 30 years old, and tell her, no, I actually kissed a girl at Brown. One thing that I remember of it is that girl whose name I forget. We were like hanging out in, I guess, like the equivalent of like a laundry room that was on campus. And there was another guy who was a total third wheel. And this guy was just, kind of hanging around, kind of being a cock block. And he was eating a sandwich in the same room. So it's like me and this girl, I'm trying to like make moves, and this dude's eating a sandwich. Okay. And it might've been a hot one, like the, like the homeless guys who asked for hot sandwiches you described. But he had, one of his hands was mangled. It was like deformed from birth. So this fucking guy is not only a cock block in that he's the third wheel, but he's also he has like sauce dripping down this mangled hand.
That's kind of sexy. Yeah. No, I'm sorry.
No, you know what? Actually, at the time, I should have been like, this is a sign. This is a fucking omen. Like, Lou, you should not be cheating on your high school girlfriend who you're in love with. Because look at this, you're destroying something here. That's the symbol of the deformed hand is your deformed fucking relationship. But
actually, that reminds me of something that people might regard as my most radical position, and this is not a typical libertarian view. This is just me, but it's related. I figure if you want to adhere to the spirit of the law, so to speak, and not just the letter of the law, if assault, theft, and fraud are bad, then fraud is bad because it wastes people's time or energy under false pretenses, and thus all lying is wrong, I think, unless you're lying as retaliation against an attacker in some pretty literal sense. Like, I think it's okay to lie if the mafia asks, wait, where's your brother hiding out or whatever.
mm-hmm.
But if you're just talking to innocent people, I think all lying is wrong. And I didn't realize how radical and rare that position is until I started telling people that I haven't lied since I was a teenager and decided that this is the position one should morally adhere to. And most people are like, that can't be true. That's baloney. And I mean, I don't blame them for not believing it if it's rare, but it's not that hard to do if you get in the habit of always telling the truth. The main thing is you just pretty quickly realize you have to develop some diplomatic skills. So if you're delivering bad news, tell it like it is, but assure people that, that doesn't mean that you're laughing at their failures or whatever the problem is. If somebody asks, does this shirt suit me? You don't have to say, you look ridiculous. You could just say, I think I've seen you in better ones or whatever. You don't have to be either vicious or lie about it. But I wonder how many people would end up punished, say, in jail or slapped with lawsuits if we really had, say, a legal system that regarded all lying as potentially actionable. I'd be open to that. That to some people probably sounds, as radical as some sort of crazy jihadism. But I don't know, just me trying to be a nice, moral person.
No, I hear you on that, and I'm very similar in that I make things very awkward for my wife when we go out to eat, because when we go out to eat, ultimately at some point in the meal, the waiter is going to ask, how is everything? Or are you enjoying that? And there was a place where we ate this kind of a upbeat or posh kind of Mexican restaurant. And I ordered tacos, pork tacos, and they were off. There was just something about them that just wasn't working. And the waiter came over and asked, are you do you like the tacos? Are you enjoying them? And I said no. And he said, okay, would you like me to take them away? No. Would you like me to get you something different? No. So now I just put this person in a position where there's absolutely nothing they can do, but all I wanted them to know was that I was unhappy, and I feel, and there have been times at restaurants where like they'll take the item off the bill and I'll be very upset about that, or they'll comp me in something. It's like, that's not what this is about.
You don't want to be a mooch.
No, exactly. It's not about, I don't go out to try to get a deal, or wow, I really haggled that restaurant. This was me just, you asked me, and I want you to know how unhappy you made me, right? If you didn't ask me, I wouldn't have been the one to tell you, like, this isn't bad. And yeah, the amount of times, like, my wife would be like, don't, and my wife, she's not like a loud person or fighter or anything like that. So yeah, putting my wife in those very weird positions, and it's like, I don't have to do that. Like, why am I doing that? But a little part of what do they say when you lie? A little part of the world dies. Was that someone say that?
I'm not sure of the saying, but I think there is a sense in which it undermines everyone's ability to trust and collaborate and believe. Although having naivete crushed can also be a useful thing. I also, you mentioned skepticism earlier, and before I even had any real political philosophy, as a teenager, the first movement I ever felt that I was a part of was the so-called skeptics movement.
Very similar. Very similar. That was sort of how I found my way over to libertarianism.
Yeah, it was sort of the same with me. So as a teenager, I suppose some of our more conservative acquaintances would have considered me the annoying town atheist type. Although I don't think I was too loud about it, but I was very committed to the position, and then it was more in my late teens applied the same sort of skepticism to government. Oh, I should say, for those who don't know, the skeptics movement is basically pro-science and says that you shouldn't believe things or espouse things without having good, solid evidence. You should not behave like a new ager, to use a term popular in the 1980s, who just thinks that belief is whatever you want it to be, and you can have your own reality and all that. I thought that sort of thinking was a disaster. Science had accomplished great things. I was, of course, a nerd as a child, so I thought that system of thought that gave us chemistry and engineering and space flight was a good thing. I didn't want everybody to turn into a bunch of mystics or hippies like you might find at Brown, who believe in crystals or whatever. So I have a few years there in my formative teen period of thinking myself first and foremost as a skeptic, and thus was also not as drawn to sort of the religious right, which was popular then, as probably some non-leftists would have been in my milieu. So even before I encountered libertarianism, I was this sort of neither left nor right creature who was trying to be a rational individual. And you can see how that would lead to one perhaps turning into an Ayn Rand type or a libertarian or something like it. Yeah. If anything, I have become, I think, a little bit more agnostic than I was as a teen, in that although I still do not know of any evidence or any solid evidence for any paranormal phenomena, including God, you can't live through the past few decades without thinking the world is very strange, and there could be things about it that are true that I never previously imagined. Also, by the time you're my age, you start to realize that it's not just the cranks and the fringe people who are full of baloney. It's also the esteemed scientists and respected corporations and beloved officials. So it's entirely possible that some stupid fad has swept science, just as it might journalism or politics or anything else. So I'm getting closer to the sort of Mulder trust no one position than I was back as a teen, when I would have said, no, go ahead and trust the scientists. Don't trust the crank non-scientists. That may have been hasty.
Yeah, no, but I would describe it over the past few years. I've been having a crisis of no faith. That it's sort of in a similar vein, and with the skeptics movement, it really opened up a world to me where the idea was, question. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Don't be afraid to ask for evidence, especially if somebody's putting forward something. And I'm not a scientist, but it works in that same way of going about things, of observing and all that, and questioning comes into all different aspects, where it's like, the reason why this is happening is because of X. And it's like, well, wait a minute. Are there any other factors that might be playing a part? And I think that naturally works itself into, a healthy skepticism of the state, of government, and what roles they're playing. Since you were talking about lies before, this is something that I've been thinking about a lot recently. And I remember seeing another anarchist bring it up. It has to do with reputation. And, we now live in a time where, forever you were always able to lie about somebody. But now the speed at which you can lie about somebody and the reach you can get is astounding. You know, you could say something about someone, and with cancel culture, you know, you could destroy somebody's life and reputation for, you know, for forever. And with that, I wonder, like, can that be construed as a violation of the non-aggression principle? Meaning, you know, if somebody talks enough shit online and lies about you, might you have a right to go knock on that person's door and, you know, go old school and beat the shit out of them? Because I've been seeing, I have a friend of mine who's a journalist, and I'm not going to name him because I don't want him getting in trouble. But I've seen quite a few people openly lie about this man, and it's really, really upsetting. And I was just thinking, like, man, you people are so lucky that he's such a sweetheart, that he's such a sweet guy with good intentions, who enters into conversations in good faith, who tries so hard to see the good in people. You are so lucky he's that guy, and not the type of guy who's like, oh, okay, I'm going to take a fucking bat to your head, you know? So what do you think about that, Todd?
Well, it's interesting. You know, there are some issues where you might expect, say, a libertarian to have a strong position, but there's actually a surprising gray area, like intellectual property rights. There's a broad spectrum of disagreement amongst libertarians on that. And there's some disagreement about whether slander and libel laws are legitimate. I kind of like them. Maybe that's that outgrowth of me not liking lying, and even thinking lying perhaps should be legally actionable. But I can understand some libertarians thinking, no, the response to false claims is true claims, and you have a right to your physical property and such, but you don't have a right to your reputation. That's too abstract. I mean, strictly speaking, by libertarian standards, you don't even have a right to your property values. You just have a right to your property, right? So like if something changes in your town and it causes your house to become less valuable, you can't sue anyone about that, right? You have to accept the fact that the market has fluctuated. So I can understand people being divided on that. But if libel and slander are akin to fraud, if people are sort of interfering with your future transactions by creating a false impression about you and your property, then maybe you have a case for acting akin to slander and libel laws. And if I'm an anarcho-capitalist who wants to get rid of the government and have private protection agencies, then maybe you do have a right to enforce a judgment against slander or libel by going to that person's house with a baseball bat. So, of course, neither you nor I are actually suggesting imminent violence against any specific person.
We don't even own a baseball bat.
That's true.
Let alone two baseball bats to make this a tag team.
But I guess really what I'm saying is, philosophically, if you ever want to find somebody who sounds at times like a respectable Republican type, but is willing to make an argument for you being able to go beat those people who lied about your friend with a baseball bat, I guess I'm your man.
All right. Yeah, because I've seen this just, you know, as recently as today. I discovered that somebody had described me as far right. And I wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal that was published at the end of 2020 about you know, my old comedy channel being described as far right, and my concern because the material we made was not far right, and I, as the head writer and producer, am not far right, and, you know, thinking about what kind of negative consequences that can have for, you know, for me and my career. And today was, you know, we're a few months removed from that. And today I saw somebody from my past had described me, and they didn't put my name, but I knew they were talking about me, described me as far right. And, you know, when something like that happens, for one, it's, you know, nobody wants to be mislabeled, you know, and I think, you know, part of my struggle is being able, you know, trying to communicate as best I can who I am and what I believe and all that. And I, you know, sometimes I do it better, you know, better than other times. But I was just thinking, like, like this person who called me far right, like if we were ever to meet face to face, like, would they want me to treat them the way a far right person would treat them? Like, because in my mind, when I think of far right, I think of, violent hooligans who, see their enemies as subhuman and that could be treated cruelly. And it's like, do you like, for one, do you really think I would see you that way? But also, do you want me to treat you that way? In the same way of, calling somebody a Nazi or a fascist. It's like face to face. How do you think a Nazi or a fascist would treat you? So, it's just something that's been on my mind and kind of making my skin crawl.
Every once in a while, you'll hear frustrated political people say, maybe we should just get away from all of these labels, right and left and so forth.
Yeah.
But of course, it's really hard to do because the labels are useful for describing people. And a lot of times if people say they don't recognize any of those labels, they're actually just being pretentious. They're not really rising above things. They just wish they were rising above the fray. However, just before we started this conversation, I did get a reminder, thanks to Twitter, of how stupid the obsession with the labels can get. So long story short, I had said there are some sleazy people on the left, like I guess the people I listed, for whatever reason, don't worry about that, were Cuomo, Biden, Woody Allen, and Derrida. And Jeet here, the left-leaning writer from The Nation, responded against me on Twitter, not by saying those people aren't sleazy, but interestingly by making the taxonomical complaint that they're not on the left. So, I mean, I guess I could go through and I did at least briefly tweet one of the people in that conversation about how I was defining left, but I don't know, I at least wouldn't call Cuomo, Biden, Derrida, and Woody Allen right-wingers or Republicans. But, that surely is an example of time wasted on the tribal labeling. And even amongst libertarians, one of the things that saddens me, to get back to what we started this conversation with about libertarians lately, is they fight so much over tribal disagreements that they end up replicating a lot of the stupidity from the non-libertarian parts of the political spectrum. So it's like if you've got a bunch of libertarians in a room, you'd hope they could sort of say, the right wingers and the left wingers aren't here. We can now get down to brass tacks and have a serious conversation about opposing the government or whatever. And instead they get together and say, and half of them say, we've got to build a wall. And the other half say, are you out of your mind? There should be no borders. Or they argue about abortion or something, or race. And I just can't help thinking, like, they've wasted all the energy that could have been devoted to arguing about things that the right and the left don't even talk about. Which is also why, boring and dry as it may sound, I kind of think groups like FEE, the Foundation for Economic Education, have roughly the right idea. Just like try to teach people economics. It goes so far because if you approach these issues via almost any other path, you might reach the right answer on that one issue, but it's not immediately obvious to a rational mind how the lessons apply to every other area of life. Whereas if you convince people that every property rights violation does harm and is a mistake, it's pretty easy to extrapolate from that and see, like, oh, okay, so stealing your car would be bad, bombing you for no reason would be bad, initiating a barroom brawl would be bad, rape is bad, and so forth. Like the other stuff follows more easily if you sell them on the strict property rights adherence idea first. So teach econ is my rather dry, nerdy solution to a lot of our problems. And of course, on both right and left, there are a lot of people right now who think that's wimpy, nerdy talk and gets us nowhere, which is sad.
Yeah, and I'm glad you bring up FEE. I'm a big fan of theirs, and Sean Malone is a buddy over there who makes really great videos. And I'm bummed because this year was going to be the 75th anniversary of of FEE, and there was going to be the celebration in Atlanta, but they ended up having to cancel it ultimately because they weren't going to be able to, I guess, do it justice with whatever. Whatever the protocols are. But yeah, they're fantastic. And I think over the past, I'd say probably like the past 4 years, they really have become their articles in particular just become so accessible, and they do such a really great job doing, what their mission statement is, which is to, give economic education. And I'm really, really a big fan of their work. Something I wanted to talk about, since we're talking about libertarians and anarchists and anarcho-capitalists, aliens. Do you think aliens are going to be libertarians? What do you think?
Well, in a sense, I think the answer is yes. In that I was talking earlier about thinking that moral and economic principles should be thought of as universal. So with luck, if there are aliens out there somewhere, they have had these same sorts of debates, and maybe even had a million more years than we have to think it over. And yes, I think ultimately they would be some sort of libertarian, which will be a rude shock to a lot of sci-fi writers and fans who lean towards socialism and think that when the aliens come, it'll be like some 1950 book where they're all wearing robes and look like Bertrand Russell, and they come out and tell everyone that they have to make their property communal. I think they're going to be surprised. Well, if the aliens ever show up, and I don't know if they will. Although I suppose that naturally leads to UFOs as a topic. Actually, there's another thing where the ground has shifted a lot in the last 5 years. So as a teenager, I was a hardcore skeptic, and for a couple of decades after that, I basically thought anybody who talked about UFOs was a moron. And I should apologize if some of those people are listening. I was a little too harsh. Sorry. I was completely dismissive of the issue, mainly because back when I was a kid, the hardcore believers, at least in the 80s, were new age types who basically thought that evidence is unnecessary. Just believe whatever you think is beautiful. And they wanted to commune with the orbs that they thought they were seeing in the sky or whatever, or the voices they heard in their dreams. There was just really no interest in hard evidence. And then it seemed like for a while the topic was fading away. And I assumed, like a lot of people, that only idiots were seeing these things or obsessing over it. And then just in the last 10 years or so, it seems like a lot of news came out about how many expert observers, especially military, have actually claimed to see these things and be unable to explain them.
Documentary that came out recently, was it the Phenomenon?
Oh yeah, yeah. And I'm not saying that any of that proves there is alien life, and people should be reminded once in a while that NASA hasn't definitively found bacteria from off-world either. So for all we know, Earth may be could be the only life in the universe, in theory. We don't know otherwise yet. And I remain skeptical about other paranormal claims like ghosts, God, psychic phenomena. I don't think any of those things are conclusively proven. However, it is interesting how voluminous the government's records of military sightings of strange things they can't quite explain are. And it's interesting that they lied about it in many cases. Like, if there's nothing going on, why are they lying about it? Now, it could just be the government lies about everything, and when in doubt, everything becomes classified. It could also be some earthly but slightly sinister explanation, like they want to frighten the Chinese or the Russians. And if you pretend that you have alien technology, maybe it makes you more intimidating, that sort of thing. Even chimpanzees understand that you can gain great power over the rest of the tribe by seizing a couple of human gas cans and banging them together and frightening the other chimpanzees. Really? They don't understand what's going on. So there could be military reasons for these things, and some of them could be military objects. They could be weird drones that we don't yet publicly acknowledge. So I don't know ultimately what's going on, but I do think it's a more legitimate area of inquiry than I would have thought 10 or 15 years ago. So I'm sort of pleased that people have started debating it. It's funny. Some people probably think that one of the most encouraging things is that the Senate Intelligence Committee says they're going to do a report in the next couple of months about what is known by the government on UFOs. And I find myself becoming akin to some of the most hardcore UFO conspiracy theorists, in that my first reaction now is not, oh, that'll be interesting, but rather, oh, they're totally going to lie. Like, no matter what they say, whether they say they're aliens or no aliens, I'm not going to believe them. Marco Rubio is going to tell me the truth about whether this is all a deep state military project. I doubt it, but I look forward to it with curiosity, at least.
Well, Sadly, I think we've gotten to the point where if if it does come out that, alien life is out there and they have connected with us and made contact with us, I think it'll be, pretty big for a couple of days, and then it'll just go away. We'll be on to something else. We'll be on to, any number of the other things that are tearing us apart, and they're arguing over. I remember watching that documentary, and it was pretty amazing seeing all of the footage from people in air and like fighter pilots and stuff like that, like trying to keep up with these things and just saying, yeah, but man-made vehicles just don't move that way. Like you can't stop on a dime and then just make like a quick maneuver like that.
At the same time, I've seen plausible sounding arguments that the apparent object in that footage is just a lens flare phenomenon. So I don't know, you'll hear these things that sound amazing, and then they usually dissolve and unravel when you look into them in greater detail. But then other times, there are cases that start out sounding ridiculous, and the more you look into it, the more plausible it seems. Actually, one of my favorite examples of that is one that might be familiar to some conservative listeners. They might be familiar with Hillsdale College, one of the few really conservative colleges in America of any prominence. And I didn't know that the UFO sighting from the 60s that was notoriously dismissed by a government expert as swamp gas, which I assume took place somewhere out in the bayou with a bunch of moonshine swilling yokels staring into the sky, happened on the campus of Hillsdale College. It was Hillsdale College in 1966. A whole bunch of people saw it. Students were looking at their dorms. They say they saw this massive shifting lights hovering at about a third-story level. Cops down in the town saw it and came running up the hill to the college to see what it was, and then it went away, and nobody could find it. And the government expert who was dispatched to study it said it may have actually, his exact phrasing, I think, was marsh gas. It may have just been a burst of marsh gas that was bioluminescing or something. And years later, he said he didn't actually believe that, and that the government had just told him tamp down these cases as quickly as they arise or public panic might occur. So he ended up becoming a big advocate for UFO disclosure, as they call it. And Gerald Ford, who was at the time the congressman for that district, urged a further investigation of what that UFO at Hillsdale actually was. So some of these cases are stranger than they at first appear, and then most of them are less significant than they at first appear.
Yeah. In this documentary, I thought the weakest part of the doc, and spoiler alert, it ends with interviews with adults who, as school children, witnessed, or according to them, witnessed a UFO landing and actually extraterrestrials. So you had a bunch of people who are older now who, as they were when they were students, I believe they were in
Zimbabwe.
Was it Zimbabwe?
It's sort of embarrassing that I know, but I bet it was the Zimbabwe case.
And just so you know, when Lou Perez was in college, I don't give a fuck about Zimbabwe. But
if it was like 1994 and the town name was Ruwe or something like that, I think.
Yeah, or something like that. So you had all of these children who said that they saw this, and as well as I guess they call them headmistress and stuff. And for me, that was the weakest part, even though you would think like, oh, here's, firsthand accounts of it. But, over the years, just hearing about, sort of mass delusions when it comes to like the satanic fears in like the 80s and 90s and made up memory and recalled memories and that sort of thing. I was like, I was a lot more. I was believing a lot more of like all the military guys, I guess, who were flight boys who had come into contact with those unidentified flying objects.
There's an interesting case that is very much like a combination of the three cases we've been talking about. If you combine Zimbabwe, Hillsdale, and the military sightings, and you fuse them all together, you sort of get a case that really happened in the 60s in Australia, where a bunch of children, a really large group, and some teachers and other adults saw some weird object hovering over the school, and then military people showed up and basically told everyone, you can't talk about this. If you have cameras and you took pictures of it, we're confiscating them. And decades later, there's still debate amongst the town folk about whether what they saw was alien or was some sort of military project that they still don't really understand. And at least a few of the kids claim that, like, one kid who was a really direct witness and walked over to whatever the thing was when it landed, suddenly left town the next day and wasn't seen again. Coincidentally or not. But if you look up that 1960s Australia case, there are still living witnesses, and they've been interviewed all together in relatively recent times, and sound convincing, although of course people can be convincing and wrong. But that case, I think, is one of the most impressive and multiple witness accounts I've heard of.
Yeah, I think I would be the wrong person to be abducted. I think I would be the wrong person physically to be abducted. Like, there's nothing super interesting about my body. Like, again, maybe if I went back in time when I was 22 and jacked, with my thick Long Island accent, maybe there would be something there. But yeah, I don't think there's anything too special about me that an alien race would particularly be interested in. You hear about all the anal probes, and it's like, there's nothing about my asshole that I think would give them any more information about the universe than they probably already know.
To quote The Simpsons, we have reached the limits of what rectal probing can teach us.
Oh my God, that's great. Before we go, I wanted to ask you about you're a writer, you have your own books, but you also ghostwrite, and I'm not going to ask the titles of those books shall remain hidden. What is it like being a ghostwriter? Because as somebody who I create my own stuff, I can't imagine typing out 200, 300 pages and putting somebody else's name on it. Like, I would at some point, I feel like I would just, I don't know, rip up the contract and go into hiding and just print it out on my own. Or how do you?
And things like that happen once in a while. I guess the important thing is, I guess, if you're a ghostwriter, to think of yourself almost like an editor rather than the person who's speaking all of these views. So you're probably being handed a whole bunch of information and stories from someone else, and your main job is to make them sound coherent and organized. So that makes it a lot easier, especially if you've done any editing, and you can distance actually, if you're thinking of it as almost an editing job, you probably don't want to put your own name on it by the end, because it isn't your voice if you're doing the job correctly. And I am tempted, though, to write another book under my own name. And I didn't entirely predict this when I was young, but I think it's going to sound more and more cynical and nihilistic the older I get. When I was young, I kind of made the conservative assumption that as you get older, you get more sort of settled into civilization in a bourgeois way. I'll probably become more accepting of many rules and patterns of society that when I was young didn't seem to make sense. And I got to say, it's not working out that way so far. In fact, it just seems like the older I get, the more I think this is all nonsense, that this is all crazy. You hear people, you hear some of the sinister, wealthy, politically connected elite talking about a great reset coming out of COVID, and in some ways, I almost find myself sympathizing. And of course, they might want more central planning, but I find myself thinking, hey, we all kind of had a breather where we sat things out for about a year because of COVID. do we really want to go back to the way things are that were? Even in the case of New York City, it pains me to see how much activity in New York has been shut down. But then I think sometimes about the activities I was a part of before COVID. Do I really want them to happen again? Like I miss parties sometimes, and then I remember, oh my gosh, those parties were awful. Do I really want that to happen again? Maybe if we just had a do-over after all this, it wouldn't be so bad. That probably sounds terribly revolutionary and unconservative, but there must be some people feeling that way.
Yeah, I think calling for a mulligan, I would feel better about it if I was confident that other people were sort of, taking this time to really figure out what's most important in life, and I just don't think that's that's the case. Where it's sort of this new world that we're looking forward to. It's sort of, what baggage are we leaving behind, but also what new baggage are we taking into that? Yeah.
I think we might end up with a situation where everyone who's very vocal or has some sort of authority will be talking as if the future must be omnipresent surveillance focused on big cities. And a huge portion of the population is basically going to come out of this thinking, I've got to move out into the woods and do a lot more hiking, just like liberate myself, get away from it all, escape. That might produce an interesting dichotomy. I sometimes think maybe I should have become a forest ranger back when I was young, and then I wouldn't have to deal with crazy New Yorkers and stuff.
No, but you'd have to deal with the Bundy Ranch, right? Those guys coming out there to take over one of your tree houses. So.
Maybe, or Sasquatch, but that's a separate topic.
That's a separate topic,
and I don't know of any good evidence for Sasquatch.
No, but he may exist on a different frequency. That's what I heard. I had a jiu-jitsu coach who was talking about Bigfoot, and was talking about how you don't necessarily see him because he might be on a different wavelength. So there we go.
I guess the superhero and sci-fi fan in me feels like that's kind of muddying the Bigfoot concept. I mean, I suppose it could turn out to be true, but there's a certain purity to him just being a big shaggy ape guy in the woods. And you start adding teleportation and multiple dimensions, and I don't know, it kind of mixes the message there. It's like genre crossing in an ugly way.
Yeah. Did you ever see, was it The Man Who Killed Hitler and Bigfoot and the Sasquatch or something like that? Did you see that?
It is on my literal list of things to see, but I have not yet gotten around to it.
I will not ruin that for you, but when you
I've heard it's not great.
No, it is. It is not. But when you see it, I want to hear what you think about it. And you know what, I'm going to give I need to plug the pieces that you write over at splice.com.
Splicetoday.com.
Splicetoday.com. Oh, did that change? Did they?
It often gets referred to casually as Splice for short, but the URL has always been splicetoday.com.
Okay, and you're still publishing stuff there pretty regularly, right?
Yep, once a week now, and a column, and usually on libertarian stuff. Oh, and I should say on a sort of a Bigfoot adjacent note that I did see Godzilla versus Kong, so I'm keeping up on the most important pop culture developments as well.
Nice. And I'm going to use that as a chance to plug my own video, Woke
Oh, yeah.
Godzilla. Everybody,
I saw
Woke that. Godzilla, and put a lot of money into that, ladies and gentlemen. Please. Please share that with people. I think there's something there, and anybody here who's a fan of my sketch comedy, my partner and my partner Greg and I had a history of really any idea that we got into that we were excited about, we would put out there, and that would often take the form of doing parodies of movies like The Hurt Locker, like a couple of years after The Hurt Locker was gone from, and nobody would ever think about that movie ever again. But God damn it, we had a dream about that, and we would put it out there. So I've sort of taken that philosophy of, am I excited about this? If I'm excited about this, let me put it out there. And I am excited about Woke Godzilla, and I really want people to see it. Please go and see it. The amount of work that went into it is pretty extraordinary.
And it's shorter than Godzilla versus Kong, so
yes,
arguably a better investment of time.
Yeah, it's about 3.5 minutes long, I believe. Close to 4. I think the Snyder cut is going to be like 4 minutes. Todd, thank you so much for joining me. Are there any plugs you'd like to put out there?
No, I think you've covered it. Splice today. Buy the book Libertarianism for Beginners from the usual bookstore type places, and maybe someday soon, vaccinated or not, I'll do public events again out and about in the world. We'll see.
That'll be fantastic. Hey guys, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to support the show, please head over to thelouperez.locals.com and go ahead and support my sponsors. Black Organic Cold Brew, head over to www.blvckbrew.com and use the promo code LOU for free shipping. And if you head over to Paloma Verde, www.palomaverdestore.com and use the promo code LOU, you'll get 25% off purchases over $75. And if you sign up for email, you'll get an extra 10% off. All right, later.